A single check for $200 million. That's what it took to topple the mightiest empire on earth in 1905. The signature belonged to Jacob Schiff, a Jewish-American banker who controlled more wealth than most European nations. The recipient? The Empire of Japan, a tiny island nation preparing for the most impossible war in modern history. Russia had armies 10 times larger, a navy that dominated the Pacific, and landmass stretching across 11 time zones. Japan had almost nothing by comparison. But what nobody understood was that this wasn't really about Japan versus Russia. This was about one man's burning desire for revenge, a vendetta that started in the ghettos of Eastern Europe and would reshape the entire global balance of power. Jacob Schiff didn't just finance a war, he engineered the collapse of an empire that had oppressed his people for centuries. The money flowed through secret channels, hidden from American and European governments who would have stopped it immediately. $200 million in 1904, money equals roughly $8 billion today. Schiff funneled this staggering sum to a nation most Americans couldn't even find on a map, betting everything on the most unlikely military victory in human history. When the dust settled, the Russian Empire lay in ruins. The Tsar had fallen. Revolution consumed Moscow and St. Petersburg, and a new world order emerged with Japan as the dominant Pacific power and America as the new financial center of the planet, all because one banker held a grudge that burned hotter than any patriotic fire. But here's what they don't teach in history books. Schiff didn't stop with financing Japan's military. He secretly funded Russian revolutionaries, smuggled weapons to Jewish resistance fighters, and used his Wall Street connections to strangle Russian credit markets across Europe. This wasn't just war. It was the most sophisticated financial warfare campaign ever executed by a private citizen. The man who accomplished this came from nothing. A German Jewish immigrant who arrived in America with barely enough money for train fare. Yet, within 30 years, he controlled the flow of global capital and could make or break entire nations with a single decision. His story reveals how financial power, properly leveraged, can achieve what armies cannot. This is the untold story of history's most consequential banker and the impossible war that changed everything. By 1904, Jacob Schiff controlled the largest private fortune in America, after only the Rockefellers and Carnegies. His investment firm, Kuhn, Loeb and Company, had financed the Pennsylvania Railroad, the Union Pacific, and virtually every major American corporation expanding westward. European royalty sought his counsel, presidents requested his endorsement. When Schiff spoke, global markets listened. Yet beneath this unprecedented success burned an obsession that consumed his every waking moment, the destruction of the Russian Empire. This hatred wasn't abstract political opposition. It was personal, visceral, and rooted in childhood trauma that shaped his worldview. Schiff had witnessed firsthand the systematic brutality of Russian pogroms, the government-sanctioned massacres that targeted Jewish communities across the empire. His own family had fled the violence, abandoning everything to escape Russian-controlled territories in Germany. Most immigrants left such memories behind, focusing on building new lives in America. Schiff was different. He nursed his hatred like a sacred flame, transforming it into the driving force behind his rise to financial dominance. Every railroad bond he sold, every corporation he funded, every political connection he cultivated, all served one ultimate purpose: accumulating enough power to strike back at the empire that had tormented his people. The opportunity came in the form of an impossible request. In late 1904, a delegation of Japanese diplomats arrived at Schiff's Manhattan office with a proposition that seemed like financial suicide. Japan needed $200 million to fight Russia, a nation with 10 times Japan's population and seemingly unlimited resources. No European bank would touch such a loan. The British, despite their rivalry with Russia, considered Japanese victory impossible. German financiers laughed at the proposal, but these diplomats had done their research. They knew about Schiff's hatred of Russia, his family's suffering under Tsarist oppression, and his reputation for taking calculated risks that others deemed insane. They weren't just seeking a loan, they were offering partnership in what amounted to the most audacious act of financial warfare in human history, The numbers seemed impossible even to Schiff. Russia's military budget dwarfed Japan's entire national economy. The Russian Baltic Fleet consisted of 38 modern warships, while Japan's navy was largely composed of British-built vessels from the previous decade. Russian forces in the Pacific numbered over 1 million soldiers, supported by the Trans-Siberian Railway that could transport endless reinforcements across the continent. Yet Schiff saw what others missed: Russia's fundamental weaknesses hidden beneath its imposing exterior. The empire was financially unstable, dependent on European loans to maintain basic government functions. Its industrial capacity lagged decades behind Western nations. Most critically, Russian forces were scattered across impossible distances, while Japan could concentrate its entire military power in a single theater. More importantly, Schiff possessed something no government could match: complete financial independence and the ability to move massive amounts of capital without oversight. While European nations debated the political implications of supporting either side, Schiff could act unilaterally, using private channels that bypassed diplomatic restrictions entirely. The Japanese delegation understood they weren't just negotiating a loan, they were forming an alliance with the most powerful private individual in global finance. Schiff brought more than money. He provided access to American industrial capacity, European credit markets, and political connections that could isolate Russia economically, while Japan prepared militarily. What made this partnership particularly dangerous was its secrecy. Neither the American government nor European powers understood the scope of Schiff's involvement. They saw routine commercial transactions, bond sales, currency exchanges, railroad investments. Behind these mundane financial instruments lay the systematic funding of an impossible war designed to achieve what no European coalition had accomplished: the complete humiliation of Russian imperial power. Schiff's strategy went far beyond simple military financing. He planned to simultaneously support Japanese forces while undermining Russian stability from within. This meant secretly funding revolutionary groups operating inside Russia, disrupting Russian access to European capital markets, and using his media connections to shape American public opinion against Russian interests. The plan's audacity was breathtaking. A private citizen was essentially declaring financial war on one of Earth's largest empires, using a small island nation as his proxy army. Success would reshape the global balance of power and establish new financial centers to rival London and Paris. Failure would destroy Schiff's reputation and potentially trigger an international crisis that could destabilize world markets. But for Jacob Schiff, the choice was never really in doubt. This wasn't about profit or political ideology, it was about justice. The Russian Empire had systematically murdered, oppressed, and expelled his people for centuries. Now he possessed the power to strike back, and he would risk everything to see that empire burn. The first meeting between Schiff and the Japanese delegation lasted 6 hours. By the end, they had outlined the framework for the most sophisticated act of private warfare in human history. Within months, Japanese ships would sail against Russian fleets, funded by American money channeled through secret financial networks that Schiff had spent decades constructing. What none of them could predict was how completely their impossible gamble would succeed, or how dramatically it would reshape the world they knew. Chapter 1. Humble Origins. Jacob Henry Schiff entered the world on January 10, 1847, in the cramped quarters above his father's brokerage house in Frankfurt am Main. The smell of ledger ink and the sound of heated negotiations in multiple languages formed his earliest memories. Moses Schiff dealt in government bonds and currency exchange, serving Jewish merchants who couldn't access Gentile banking houses that dominated German finance. This wasn't prosperity by any measure, it was survival disguised as commerce. The Schiff family lived under crushing restrictions imposed by Frankfurt's anti-Jewish laws. Jacob's father could conduct business only within designated areas, couldn't own property outside the Jewish quarter, and required special permits for basic activities like traveling between cities. Every transaction carried the risk of confiscation by authorities who viewed Jewish financial activity with deep suspicion. Yet within these constraints, young Jacob witnessed something remarkable: how money could transcend social barriers that seemed absolute. When Gentile merchants needed quick access to Eastern European markets or currency conversion for international trade, they quietly approached Moses Schiff despite the social taboos. Gold spoke a language that overcame religious prejudice, at least temporarily. Jacob's education began with Hebrew lessons and Talmudic study, but his father insisted on practical training that would prove more valuable than religious scholarship. By age 10, Jacob could calculate compound interest in his head, convert between a dozen different currencies, and identify counterfeit coins by weight and sound. Moses Schiff understood that knowledge was the only possession that couldn't be confiscated by hostile authorities. The turning point came in 1848, when revolutionary fervor swept across Europe. Liberal movements demanded equal rights for Jewish populations, dismantling centuries of discriminatory laws. For a brief moment, it seemed that merit rather than religious background might determine success. Moses Schiff saw opportunity in this chaos and began expanding his operations beyond Frankfurt's Jewish quarter. But the liberal revolution collapsed within months, replaced by conservative governments that blamed Jewish financial involvement for the political upheaval. New restrictions appeared almost overnight, more severe than before. Jewish businesses faced organized boycotts. Authorities conducted surprise inspections, confiscating records and arresting merchants on dubious charges. The violence began in nearby villages and spread toward Frankfurt like a plague. Jacob, now 12, watched through his bedroom window as mobs attacked Jewish homes and businesses just blocks from his family's house. The sound of breaking glass and screaming voices haunted his dreams for decades afterward. His father spent entire nights standing guard with a loaded pistol, knowing that police wouldn't respond to calls for help from the Jewish quarter. Moses Schiff made the decision that would shape his son's destiny. The family would emigrate to America, where Jewish citizens reportedly enjoyed full legal equality. But leaving required liquidating the brokerage business in secret, converting assets to portable wealth without alerting authorities who might block their departure or confiscate their money. This process took 2 years of careful planning. Moses gradually shifted investments from German government bonds to British securities that could be transferred to London banks. He cultivated relationships with Jewish merchants already established in New York, securing promises of employment and housing. Most critically, he taught Jacob advanced financial techniques that would prove essential in America's more complex marketplace. The family's departure from Frankfurt in 1865 was carefully orchestrated to avoid suspicion. They left in stages, with Moses traveling first to establish business connections in New York, while Jacob remained in London to complete his education at a private academy that specialized in international banking. This separation, though painful, provided Jacob with sophisticated training unavailable in Germany. London opened Jacob's eyes to possibilities he'd never imagined. British banks operated on a scale that dwarfed German provincial finance, moving capital across global markets with speed and precision. He studied the mechanisms of international trade, railroad financing, and government bond markets that connected London to every continent. More importantly, he observed how Jewish financiers like the Rothschilds had transcended their origins to become indispensable to British imperial expansion. The contrast with his Frankfurt childhood was overwhelming. In London, successful Jewish businessmen owned magnificent homes, attended opera performances, and socialized with British aristocracy. Wealth had purchased not just legal equality, but genuine social acceptance. This revelation crystallized Jacob's ambition. He would achieve such success that religious background became irrelevant to his social standing. Yet even in cosmopolitan London, Jacob encountered subtle reminders of Jewish vulnerability. British newspapers regularly published articles about Russian pogroms, describing massacres of Jewish communities with clinical detachment. These reports horrified Jacob not just because of their brutality, but because they demonstrated how quickly tolerance could transform into murderous hatred. The Russian Empire represented everything he'd fled from Germany, magnified by absolute imperial power and geographic scale. These London years also introduced Jacob to international finance's hidden networks. Jewish banking houses maintained connections across national boundaries, facilitating trade and investment despite political conflicts between their host countries. The Rothschilds in particular had perfected this model, using family connections to operate simultaneously in London, Paris, Vienna, Naples, and Frankfurt. Jacob studied their methods obsessively, recognizing that such networks could provide both enormous profits and protection against political persecution. When Jacob finally sailed to New York in 1865, he carried more than his father's modest savings. He possessed sophisticated knowledge of international finance, fluency in multiple languages, and connections to established Jewish banking families. Most importantly, he had developed an unshakable conviction that financial power represented the only reliable defense against persecution. America initially overwhelmed him with its chaotic energy. New York's financial district bustled with an intensity that made London seem sedate. Railroad construction was transforming the continent, creating investment opportunities on an unprecedented scale. Government bonds financed by wartime spending offered enormous profits to investors brave enough to bet on Union victory. For someone with Jacob's training and ambition, the possibilities seemed limitless. Moses Schiff had secured employment for his son at Kuhn, Loeb and Company, a small but respected investment firm founded by German Jewish immigrants. The firm's partners, Abraham Kuhn and Solomon Loeb, recognized Jacob's exceptional abilities immediately. Within months, he was handling complex transactions that seasoned bankers found challenging. His combination of old-world sophistication and new-world ambition made him invaluable to clients seeking European investment opportunities. But Jacob's true education came from observing American anti-Semitism, which operated differently than European prejudice, but remained equally destructive. Social clubs excluded Jewish members regardless of their wealth or accomplishments. Prestigious universities maintained unofficial quotas limiting Jewish enrollment. Even successful Jewish businessmen faced subtle but persistent discrimination that reminded them of their outsider status. These experiences reinforced lessons learned during his Frankfurt childhood. Prosperity alone couldn't guarantee security, and even the most successful Jewish families remained vulnerable to political shifts that could destroy their achievements overnight. Jacob vowed that his success would be so complete, his financial power so essential to American interests, that discrimination would become impossible rather than merely impolite. The Russian Empire loomed over these calculations like a dark cloud. News from Eastern Europe brought regular reports of government-sponsored pogroms that made German anti-Semitism seem mild by comparison. Entire Jewish communities disappeared overnight, their populations murdered or driven into exile. The Tsarist government openly encouraged these massacres, viewing Jewish persecution as a useful tool for directing popular discontent away from imperial failures. For Jacob Schiff, these reports represented more than distant tragedy. They were reminders of what he'd escaped and warnings of what could return. The Russian Empire embodied systematic oppression elevated to imperial policy, and its continued existence threatened Jewish communities worldwide. As his wealth and influence grew, so did his determination to see that empire destroyed. By 1870, Jacob had become a full partner in Kuhn, Loeb and Company and married Therese Loeb, daughter of the firm's co-founder. This marriage cemented his position within New York's German Jewish financial community while providing access to capital that would fuel his rapid expansion. But even as he celebrated these personal and professional achievements, Jacob's thoughts turned increasingly toward the empire that had driven his family from their homeland. The seeds of the most audacious act of financial warfare in human history were planted in those early American years, nourished by memories of Frankfurt's terror and strengthened by growing awareness of his own power to influence world events. Chapter 2. Wall Street. By 1875, Jacob Schiff had transformed Kuhn, Loeb and Company from a modest German Jewish investment house into one of Wall Street's most aggressive and successful firms. The transformation began with railroad bonds, an investment category that established American financial houses considered too risky and European bankers simply ignored. Schiff saw opportunity where others saw chaos. America's railroad expansion created financing needs that dwarfed anything European markets had experienced. Individual railroad companies required capital investments larger than most national budgets. The Pennsylvania Railroad alone needed $50 million to complete its western expansion, more money than many European governments spent annually. Traditional banking houses approached such projects cautiously, offering limited credit with stringent conditions. Schiff adopted a radically different strategy. Rather than merely lending money to railroad companies, he insisted on equity participation and management control. This approach terrified conservative bankers who preferred predictable interest payments over uncertain profit shares, but Schiff understood that America's railroad boom represented more than transportation infrastructure. It was reshaping the entire global economy. His first major success came with the Louisville and Nashville Railroad, a medium-sized company struggling to compete against larger rivals. Schiff provided not just financing, but strategic guidance, helping management optimize routes, reduce operating costs, and expand into profitable freight markets. Within 3 years, L&N's stock price tripled, generating enormous profits for Kuhn, Loeb and Company, while establishing Schiff's reputation as more than just another financier. This success attracted attention from larger railroad companies facing similar challenges. The Union Pacific Railroad, despite its transcontinental scope, was hemorrhaging money due to construction cost overruns and political corruption scandals. Previous investors had withdrawn support, leaving UP management desperate for both capital and credibility. Schiff's involvement with Union Pacific marked his emergence as a major force in American finance. He provided $60 million in financing while demanding complete restructuring of company operations. This meant replacing corrupt management, renegotiating government contracts, and implementing accounting systems that eliminated the fraudulent practices that had plagued railroad construction. The financial press initially criticized Schiff's involvement, suggesting that a German Jewish immigrant lacked the experience to manage America's most important transportation company. These attacks carried obvious anti-Semitic undertones, but they also reflected genuine concern about foreign influence in strategic American industries. Schiff responded by delivering results that silenced his critics. Within 2 years, Union Pacific had become profitable and was paying regular dividends to shareholders. More importantly, Schiff's success with Union Pacific opened doors to international finance that had previously remained closed to American investment houses. European investors, particularly British pension funds and insurance companies, began directing capital toward American securities through Kuhn, Loeb and Company. This development fundamentally altered global capital flows, making New York a legitimate rival to London as a center of international finance. Schiff leveraged these European connections to expand beyond railroad financing into government securities, corporate bonds and international currency exchange. Kuhn, Loeb and Company became the primary American dealer for European investors seeking exposure to America's rapidly growing economy. By 1880, the firm was handling transactions worth hundreds of millions of dollars annually, generating profits that rivaled established European banking houses. But Schiff's most significant innovation involved the systematic use of financial networks to achieve political objectives. Unlike traditional bankers who avoided controversial political involvement, Schiff understood that economic power could be translated into political influence through careful relationship building and strategic investment decisions. This approach became evident in his handling of government bond sales during the economic crisis of 1893. When the Federal Treasury faced imminent bankruptcy due to gold standard pressures, traditional banking houses demanded punitive interest rates that would have crippled government finances for decades. Schiff organized a syndicate of international investors willing to purchase government bonds at reasonable rates, effectively saving the American economy from collapse. President Grover Cleveland personally thanked Schiff for his intervention, beginning a relationship that would provide Kuhn, Loeb and Company with privileged access to government financial planning. This connection proved invaluable as American foreign policy became increasingly complex, requiring sophisticated understanding of international financial markets. Schiff's growing influence attracted attention from other members of New York's German Jewish financial community, particularly the Warburg brothers who had recently emigrated from Hamburg. Max Warburg brought expertise in international currency trading, while Paul Warburg specialized in central banking theory that would later influence Federal Reserve creation. Together, they formed an informal alliance that coordinated investment strategies across multiple firms. This coordination allowed them to manipulate markets in ways that individual firms couldn't achieve alone. When they collectively supported particular investments, prices rose dramatically. When they withdrew support, entire sectors could collapse within days. The financial press began referring to them as the German Jewish Banking Syndicate, a description that carried both respect and subtle resentment. European competitors took notice of these developments with growing alarm. The Rothschilds, who had dominated international finance for nearly a century, suddenly faced serious competition from American upstarts who operated with fewer restrictions and greater flexibility. British banking houses complained that German Jewish immigrants were undermining traditional financial relationships through aggressive tactics that violated unwritten rules of conduct. These complaints intensified when Schiff began actively recruiting talent from European banking houses, offering compensation packages that established firms couldn't match. Young bankers with experience in London, Paris, and Berlin abandoned prestigious positions to join Kuhn, Loeb and Company, bringing sophisticated expertise that further enhanced the firm's capabilities. By 1895, Schiff controlled personal wealth estimated at $50 million, making him one of America's richest individuals. But unlike other wealthy Americans who focused on industrial expansion or land speculation, Schiff maintained extensive international connections that provided unique insights into global political developments. These insights proved particularly valuable as international tensions escalated throughout the 1890s. The Spanish-American War demonstrated America's emergence as a global power, while European nations struggled with internal instability and colonial rebellions. Schiff positioned himself at the intersection of these trends, providing financing for American expansion while maintaining relationships with European governments and financial institutions. His international perspective also kept him informed about conditions in the Russian Empire, where anti-Jewish persecution had intensified under Tsar Nicholas II. Reports from Eastern Europe described systematic massacres that surpassed previous pogroms in both scale and brutality. The Kishinev pogrom of 1903 particularly horrified Schiff, as government authorities actively participated in murders rather than simply ignoring them. These developments transformed Schiff's anti-Russian sentiments from personal resentment into active hostility. He began using his financial connections to organize American protests against Russian persecution, while simultaneously lobbying government officials to impose economic sanctions on the Tsarist regime. When these efforts proved ineffective, Schiff started exploring more direct methods of opposing Russian power. The opportunity came through his relationship with Japanese financial representatives who had been seeking American capital for military modernization programs. Japan's victory over China in 1894-95 had demonstrated the nation's potential, but subsequent expansion required resources that exceeded domestic capacity. European banks, concerned about Japanese political stability, declined to provide significant financing. Schiff saw potential that others missed. Japan's geographic position made it the natural check on Russian expansion in the Pacific, while its military capabilities offered the possibility of actually defeating Russian forces in a limited war. More importantly, Japanese success would humiliate the Tsarist regime and potentially trigger internal instability that could lead to political revolution. These calculations led Schiff to begin preliminary discussions with Japanese representatives years before formal war planning began. He provided modest financing for Japanese infrastructure projects while studying the country's economic and military capabilities. By 1900, he had concluded that Japan could successfully challenge Russian power with adequate financial support. The final piece of the puzzle involved coordination with other anti-Russian elements in American finance. Schiff cultivated relationships with railroad executives who resented Russian interference in Chinese markets, industrial leaders concerned about Russian territorial expansion, and politicians who viewed the Tsarist regime as fundamentally opposed to democratic values. By 1903, this informal coalition had evolved into a sophisticated network capable of mobilizing enormous financial resources against Russian interests. When Japanese representatives approached Schiff with their audacious proposal for war financing, they found not just a willing partner, but the architect of a comprehensive strategy for Russian imperial destruction. The stage was set for the most ambitious act of private warfare in human history, orchestrated by a German Jewish immigrant who had transformed personal resentment into global financial power. Chapter 3: Russian Hatred. The telegram arrived at Jacob Schiff's Manhattan office on April 19, 1903, carrying news that would transform his focused resentment into burning obsession. The Kishinev pogrom had lasted 3 days, leaving 49 Jews dead, hundreds wounded, and over 1,000 homes destroyed. But the details revealed something far worse than random violence. This massacre had been orchestrated by Russian government officials and carried out with police participation. Schiff read the reports with growing horror. Peasants armed with clubs and axes had systematically attacked Jewish neighborhoods while local authorities watched approvingly. When Jewish families sought police protection, officers either refused assistance or actively joined the attackers. Government newspapers had spent weeks beforehand publishing inflammatory articles that portrayed Jews as enemies of Orthodox Christianity and Russian traditional values. This wasn't spontaneous mob violence. It was state-sponsored terrorism designed to terrorize an entire population into submission. The Kishinev pogrom represented everything Schiff had escaped from German anti-Semitism, magnified by absolute imperial power and systematic cruelty that shocked even experienced observers of Russian brutality. The international response proved equally infuriating. European governments issued formal protests that carried no consequences, while American officials expressed concern without taking meaningful action. President Theodore Roosevelt condemned the violence, but refused to impose economic sanctions or restrict diplomatic relations with Russia. The Tsarist regime faced no practical punishment for mass murder carried out with official approval. For Schiff, this inadequate response demonstrated the futility of conventional diplomacy when confronting systematic oppression. Government protests and newspaper editorials couldn't protect Jewish communities from imperial violence. Only force, economic or military, could compel the Russian Empire to abandon its persecution policies. And if governments wouldn't apply such force, private citizens with sufficient resources would have to act independently. The Kishinev massacre crystallized decades of accumulated anger into a focused determination for revenge. Schiff began systematically studying Russian economic vulnerabilities, identifying pressure points where financial warfare could inflict maximum damage on the Tsarist regime. His research revealed an empire that appeared mighty from the outside, but suffered from fundamental structural weaknesses that skilled manipulation could exploit. Russia's government finances depended heavily on European loans to fund basic operations. French banks provided the largest source of credit, followed by German and British institutions that viewed Russian bonds as secure investments backed by vast natural resources. Without access to these foreign capital markets, the Tsarist government would face immediate bankruptcy and potential political collapse. Military expenses consumed enormous portions of the Russian budget, particularly maintaining forces across the empire's vast territory. The Trans-Siberian Railway represented the largest infrastructure project in human history, requiring continuous capital investment to complete construction and maintain operations. Any disruption to this financing would paralyze Russian strategic capabilities. Most importantly, Russia's industrial development lagged far behind Western European standards. The empire possessed abundant raw materials, but lacked manufacturing capacity to process them domestically. This dependence on foreign technology and expertise created opportunities for economic pressure that could cripple military modernization programs essential to maintaining imperial control. Schiff began implementing his anti-Russian strategy through seemingly routine business decisions. When Russian government bonds appeared in American markets, Kuhn, Loeb and Company refused participation regardless of potential profits. When American companies considered Russian investments, Schiff lobbied against such partnerships while offering alternative opportunities in other markets. These individual actions had limited impact, but Schiff coordinated similar responses from other members of New York's Jewish financial community. The result was systematic exclusion of Russian securities from American capital markets, forcing the Tsarist government to pay higher interest rates for European financing while limiting access to American industrial expertise. Schiff's campaign expanded beyond simple financial boycotts to include active support for Russian opposition groups. He provided funding for Jewish self-defense organizations that protected communities from pogrom attacks, while also supporting broader revolutionary movements that sought to overthrow the Tsarist regime entirely. These contributions were carefully laundered through charitable organizations and cultural institutions to avoid detection by American or Russian authorities. The most significant aspect of this support involved weapons smuggling operations that supplied Jewish communities with means to defend themselves against organized attacks. Schiff used his extensive shipping connections to transport firearms from American manufacturers to European ports, then onto Russian territory through networks established by revolutionary organizations. These activities required extraordinary secrecy, as discovery would have triggered severe diplomatic consequences. The American government officially maintained friendly relations with Russia, and private citizens conducting unauthorized arms trafficking could face prosecution under federal neutrality laws. Schiff operated through multiple layers of intermediaries, ensuring that direct connections to illegal activities couldn't be established even under intensive investigation. The weapons smuggling operations achieved remarkable success, fundamentally altering the dynamics of anti-Jewish violence across the Russian Empire. Communities that had previously suffered passive victimization began fighting back against pogrom attacks, inflicting casualties on their attackers and forcing government authorities to reconsider their tolerance for organized violence. The Battle of Gomel in 1903 demonstrated this transformation most dramatically. When organized mobs attacked the Jewish quarter, they encountered armed resistance that killed dozens of attackers and wounded hundreds more. Local police, unprepared for serious opposition, called for military reinforcements to restore order. The incident received international attention as evidence that Russian Jews would no longer accept victimization without resistance. Schiff took particular satisfaction in these developments, viewing armed resistance as both practical self-defense and symbolic rejection of imperial oppression. Each successful defense operation validated his conviction that financial resources properly applied could achieve political objectives that conventional diplomacy couldn't accomplish. But weapons smuggling and community defense represented only preliminary stages in Schiff's comprehensive anti-Russian strategy. His ultimate objective involved destroying the Tsarist regime's international credibility, while simultaneously supporting military forces capable of inflicting decisive defeats on Russian armies. This required finding proxy combatants willing to fight Russia directly, backed by financial resources sufficient to sustain prolonged warfare. The opportunity emerged from Japan's growing confrontation with Russian expansion in Manchuria and Korea. Both empires sought control over strategic territories that would determine future dominance in East Asia. Diplomatic negotiations had reached deadlock, with neither side willing to compromise on fundamental territorial claims. Military conflict seemed inevitable, creating exactly the situation Schiff needed to implement his plans for Russian destruction. Japanese military capabilities impressed Schiff during his preliminary research. The nation had successfully modernized its armed forces using European advisors and American technology, creating professional military institutions that rivaled Western standards. Japan's naval expansion program particularly showed promise, with new battleships and cruisers that could potentially challenge Russian naval supremacy in the Pacific. More importantly, Japan possessed advantages that could overcome Russia's apparent superiority in numbers and resources. Japanese forces would operate close to their home bases, while Russian armies depended on supply lines stretching thousands of miles across Siberian wilderness. Japanese military planning emphasized speed and concentration, while Russian strategy relied on overwhelming force applied gradually across vast frontiers. Schiff recognized that Japanese victory over Russia would achieve multiple objectives simultaneously. Military defeat would humiliate the Tsarist regime and potentially trigger internal revolution that could overthrow the government entirely. Russian withdrawal from East Asia would eliminate imperial pressure on Jewish communities in border regions. Most importantly, successful financial support for Japan would demonstrate the power of coordinated international action against oppressive regimes. The challenge involved providing financing on a scale that exceeded anything previously attempted by private investors. Japan needed hundreds of millions of dollars to sustain warfare against an empire with vastly superior resources. European banks considered such loans impossibly risky, while American financial institutions lacked experience with large-scale military financing. Schiff's solution involved creating an international syndicate that would distribute risk among multiple investors while providing Japan with continuous access to capital markets throughout the conflict. This required unprecedented cooperation between American, British, and German banking houses, coordinated through personal relationships that Schiff had cultivated over decades of international business. By late 1903, preliminary discussions had begun with potential syndicate members who shared Schiff's antipathy toward Russian expansion. British financiers resented Russian competition in Asian markets, while German bankers opposed Russian influence in European affairs. Japanese military success would serve all their interests while providing substantial profits from bond sales and currency exchange operations. The final element involved ensuring American government neutrality that would allow unrestricted financial support for Japanese war efforts. Schiff used his political connections to lobby for policies that treated Japanese bond sales as routine commercial transactions rather than prohibited military assistance. This required careful coordination with State Department officials who understood the strategic benefits of Japanese success but couldn't openly support anti-Russian activities. When Japanese representatives finally approached Schiff with their formal request for war financing, they found a comprehensive strategy already in place. The most audacious act of private warfare in human history was ready to begin, driven by one man's determination to see the Russian Empire destroyed. Chapter 4. Japanese Contact. The meeting that would reshape global power began with an unlikely knock on Jacob Schiff's office door on November 30th, 1904. His secretary announced visitors from the Japanese consulate who requested a private audience regarding matters of mutual interest. Schiff had been expecting this contact for months, but the formal moment still carried electric tension as he prepared to cross the line from financial opposition to active warfare against the Russian Empire. Baron Takahashi Korekiyo entered first, a diminutive man whose quiet demeanor concealed razor-sharp intelligence and diplomatic skills honed through decades of international negotiation. Behind him came Marquis Kaneko Kentaro, whose Harvard education and fluent English made him Japan's most effective representative to American audiences. Together, they embodied Japan's careful strategy of approaching Schiff not as desperate supplicants, but as sophisticated partners, proposing mutually beneficial cooperation. The initial conversation proceeded with elaborate courtesy that masked the revolutionary nature of their discussion. Takahashi explained Japan's need for foreign capital to fund military modernization programs, while Kaneko emphasized the defensive nature of Japanese preparations against Russian territorial expansion. Neither man explicitly mentioned war, but all three participants understood they were negotiating the financing for the most improbable military campaign in modern history. Schiff listened carefully while studying his visitors for signs of the competence and determination that would be essential for success against Russian armies. Takahashi's presentation revealed sophisticated understanding of international financial markets and realistic assessment of the challenges Japan would face. Kaneko demonstrated political sophistication that suggested Japanese leadership had carefully planned their approach to this crucial alliance. More importantly, both men clearly understood Schiff's personal motivations without requiring explicit discussion of his anti-Russian sentiments. They had researched his background thoroughly, from his family's flight from German persecution to his systematic opposition to Russian financial interests. This preparation indicated serious commitment that went beyond merely seeking available credit. They were offering partnership in a shared crusade against imperial oppression. The financial requirements they outlined staggered even Schiff's experienced perspective. Japan needed immediate access to $50 million for naval expansion, followed by additional loans totaling $150 million over 18 months. These amounts exceeded the annual budgets of most European governments and dwarfed any previous private military financing. Success would require creating entirely new mechanisms for international capital mobilization. Schiff's initial response focused on practical rather than political considerations. He questioned Japan's ability to service such enormous debts given the nation's limited export earnings and underdeveloped industrial capacity. Takahashi responded with detailed projections, showing how military victory would provide access to Korean and Manchurian resources that could generate sufficient revenue for debt repayment. These projections revealed the audacious scope of Japanese planning. Victory wouldn't simply restore the pre-war status quo, it would establish Japan as the dominant power in East Asia, controlling strategic territories that Russia had spent decades developing. The war loans weren't just financing military operations. They were funding Japan's transformation from regional power to global empire. Kaneko then addressed the political dimensions that made this financing possible. American strategic interests favored Japanese success, as Russian dominance in East Asia would threaten future American expansion in Pacific markets. President Roosevelt, despite official neutrality, privately hoped for Japanese victory that would check Russian imperial ambitions without requiring American military involvement. This alignment between Japanese objectives and American interests provided crucial cover for Schiff's participation. Rather than betraying American neutrality, supporting Japan actually advanced broader national interests while simultaneously serving Schiff's personal agenda for Russian destruction. The convergence transformed what might have appeared as private vengeance into patriotic service to American strategic objectives. The conversation then turned to specific mechanisms for providing the requested financing. Traditional government-to-government loans were impossible given American neutrality requirements, while direct private loans exceeded any individual institution's capacity. Schiff proposed creating an international syndicate that would distribute risk among multiple investors while providing Japan with reliable access to capital throughout the conflict. This syndicate approach offered several critical advantages. Risk distribution would encourage participation from conservative European banks that couldn't independently justify such enormous exposure. International involvement would provide political protection for participants who could claim legitimate commercial motivations rather than anti-Russian hostility. Most importantly, syndicate structure would allow continuous refinancing that could sustain Japanese war efforts indefinitely. Takahashi immediately grasped the implications of this proposal. Rather than receiving fixed amounts based on immediate military needs, Japan would gain access to dynamic financing that could expand as opportunities developed. This meant Japanese military planners could pursue ambitious objectives without worrying about resource constraints that might force premature peace negotiations. The discussion moved to practical details about bond structure, interest rates, and collateral requirements. Schiff insisted on terms that balanced Japanese financial capacity with investor expectations for reasonable returns. Interest rates would be competitive with government securities from established European nations, while collateral would consist of customs revenues and railroad concessions that provided secure income streams. These financial arrangements reflected Schiff's long-term strategic thinking. Reasonable terms would encourage broad investor participation while establishing precedents for future Japanese financing needs. Excessive demands might secure short-term profits but would limit Japan's ability to sustain extended warfare that could achieve complete Russian defeat. Kaneko raised concerns about American government reaction to large-scale Japanese bond sales that might appear to violate neutrality requirements. Schiff addressed these worries by explaining how careful structuring could present military loans as routine commercial transactions indistinguishable from railroad or industrial financing. Legal technicalities would provide plausible cover for activities that served American strategic interests. The meeting concluded with agreement on basic principles, but implementation required extensive preparation that would test Schiff's organizational capabilities. Creating the international syndicate meant coordinating with British, German, and French banking houses that had their own complex relationships with Russian financial markets. Each potential participant would need careful persuasion based on their specific interests and concerns. Schiff immediately began this diplomatic campaign, using personal relationships developed over decades of international business. His first approach went to the Rothschilds in London, whose antipathy toward Russian anti-Semitism provided common ground, despite their general preference for conservative investment strategies. Convincing them required demonstrating that Japanese success would serve British imperial interests in addition to providing reasonable financial returns. The response from British financiers exceeded Schiff's expectations. While officially neutral toward the Russian Empire, British strategic planners viewed Russian expansion in Asia as a direct threat to Indian security. Japanese military success would eliminate this pressure without requiring British resources or political commitments. Several major London banking houses quietly indicated willingness to participate in appropriate financing arrangements. German financial institutions proved more difficult to persuade, as German government policy officially supported Russian interests in European affairs. However, individual German banks resented Russian competition in Ottoman and Persian markets, creating opportunities for private cooperation despite public political alignment. Schiff's extensive German Jewish connections provided access to decision-makers who could approve participation without government oversight. French participation presented the greatest challenge, as French banks provided the largest source of Russian government financing. Supporting Japanese war efforts would directly undermine their existing Russian investments while potentially triggering diplomatic complications with a crucial European ally. Schiff approached this problem indirectly, through Belgian and Dutch intermediaries who could provide French capital without obvious political implications. By February 1905, Schiff had assembled preliminary commitments from institutions controlling over $300 million in available capital. This syndicate structure would allow Japan to access resources that exceeded the annual budgets of major European powers, providing financial capabilities that could sustain warfare against the Russian Empire indefinitely. The final step involved formal negotiations between Japanese representatives and syndicate members to establish specific terms for bond issuance and capital deployment. These discussions would determine not only the immediate success of Japanese military operations, but the broader future of global power relationships in the 20th century. Chapter 5: Secret Bonds. The first Japanese government bonds appeared in American financial markets on February 11, 1905, disguised as routine infrastructure securities that concealed their true purpose, financing the most audacious military campaign in modern history. Schiff had spent weeks carefully crafting these instruments to bypass neutrality restrictions while providing Japan with immediate access to American capital markets. The bonds carried the innocuous designation Imperial Japanese Railway Development Notes, suggesting peaceful economic expansion rather than military preparation. Official documentation described funding for railroad construction in Korea and Manchuria, territories that Japan claimed required improved transportation infrastructure. Potential investors saw standard infrastructure financing backed by territorial assets and guaranteed customs revenues. Behind this mundane facade lay the most sophisticated financial deception ever attempted. The railroad development funds would immediately flow to Japanese military accounts, purchasing warships, artillery, and ammunition that European manufacturers refused to supply on credit. Construction contracts would go to companies producing military equipment rather than civilian infrastructure. Track laying would occur along strategic routes designed for troop movement rather than commercial transport. Schiff orchestrated this deception through layers of intermediaries that obscured the bond's military purpose. Kuhn, Loeb and Company served as primary underwriter, but actual sales occurred through dozens of smaller investment houses that specialized in infrastructure securities. These firms understood the bond's true nature, but maintained careful documentation showing legitimate commercial transactions that couldn't be challenged by government investigators. The initial offering raised $50 million within 3 days, demonstrating unprecedented investor confidence in Japanese creditworthiness. European participation exceeded Schiff's most optimistic projections, with British insurance companies purchasing 40% of available bonds, while German pension funds absorbed another 30%. Even French investors, despite their government's Russian alliance, quietly acquired substantial positions through Swiss intermediaries. This overwhelming success reflected careful preparation that had convinced international investors of Japan's fundamental strength, despite the apparent impossibility of victory over Russia. Schiff's syndicate had commissioned detailed economic studies that demonstrated Japan's superior industrial efficiency and fiscal discipline compared to Russian governmental chaos. These reports transformed the conflict from impossible gamble into calculated investment in inevitable Japanese triumph. The bond structure itself embodied sophisticated financial engineering that maximized Japanese flexibility while protecting investor interests. Rather than fixed-term obligations, the securities contained convertible features that allowed refinancing as military circumstances evolved. Interest payments could be deferred if necessary, preventing default during intensive combat operations. Most importantly, success premiums would provide substantial profits if Japan achieved territorial gains that generated additional revenue streams. Schiff personally managed the most sensitive aspect of this operation, coordinating payment flows that reached Japanese military accounts without creating documentary evidence of neutrality violations. Funds moved through correspondent banking relationships in London, Amsterdam, and Hamburg before arriving in Japanese banks as apparently routine commercial transfers. American authorities who monitored suspicious international transactions found standard business documentation that revealed nothing about the money's ultimate military purpose. The complexity of these arrangements required unprecedented cooperation between financial institutions that normally competed aggressively for market share. Schiff's personal relationships with senior executives at competing firms proved essential for securing the discretion that made large-scale coordination possible. Participants understood they were engaging in activities that challenged traditional banking practices, but potential profits and strategic benefits justified the extraordinary cooperation. Japanese military purchasing operations demonstrated equal sophistication in converting financial resources into combat capabilities without triggering international diplomatic protests. Rather than directly approaching European arms manufacturers, Japanese agents used Canadian and Mexican intermediaries who placed orders for police equipment and mining supplies that happened to include artillery shells and military explosives. British shipyards provided the most crucial assistance through creative contract interpretation that supplied Japan with modern warships disguised as merchant vessels. These ships left British ports with civilian designations but carried hidden armaments that could be installed quickly upon reaching Japanese territorial waters. The Royal Navy's unofficial cooperation reflected British strategic calculations that favored Japanese naval expansion as a counterweight to Russian Pacific ambitions. German industrial cooperation proved equally valuable, though it required more elaborate concealment due to Germany's official Russian alliance. Krupp Armaments Works supplied artillery through Chilean brokers who allegedly purchased weapons for South American conflicts. Chemical companies provided explosives labeled as mining supplies. Most significantly, German naval architects assisted Japanese shipbuilding efforts by providing technical expertise that dramatically accelerated warship construction schedules. American industrial participation focused on providing raw materials and manufacturing equipment that enhanced Japanese military production capabilities. Steel companies sold armor plating supposedly intended for commercial construction projects. Machine tool manufacturers supplied precision equipment ostensibly for civilian industrial expansion. These transactions appeared routine, but collectively represented massive technology transfer that advanced Japanese military capabilities by decades. The financial flows supporting these purchases reached extraordinary volumes by spring 1905. Schiff's syndicate was processing over $20 million monthly in Japanese-related transactions, rivaling the capital movements associated with major European government financing. This scale required continuous expansion of the syndicate structure to accommodate additional investors who recognized the exceptional profit potential. European central banks began expressing concern about these capital flows, particularly as they coincided with declining Russian access to international credit markets. French monetary authorities noticed unusual patterns in international currency exchange that suggested systematic coordination against Russian financial interests. German central bankers reported similar observations, though their government's political alignment prevented direct investigation. These concerns intensified when Russian government bonds began trading at substantial discounts, despite the empire's apparent military advantages. International investors were quietly liquidating Russian positions while accumulating Japanese securities, suggesting insider knowledge about military developments that hadn't appeared in public reports. The collective wisdom of financial markets indicated Japanese victory despite conventional strategic analysis that favored Russian success. Schiff took particular satisfaction in these market developments, viewing them as validation of his strategic assessment. Professional investors with access to superior information were reaching conclusions that confirmed his intuitive understanding of Russian weaknesses and Japanese strengths. Financial markets were essentially voting for Japanese victory through the mechanism of capital allocation decisions. The most sophisticated aspect of Schiff's operation involved using derivative instruments to amplify the financial pressure on Russian interests while generating additional profits for Japanese financing. Currency swaps allowed syndicate members to profit from ruble depreciation while simultaneously undermining Russian export earnings. Commodity futures positions generated gains from disrupted Russian trade while providing Japan with secure access to essential raw materials. These derivative strategies required extraordinary coordination with London and European financial markets, where such instruments traded most actively. Schiff's international network proved essential for implementing complex strategies that individual firms couldn't execute independently. The collective result was systematic financial warfare that complemented Japanese military operations while generating resources for continued campaign financing. By April 1905, Schiff's syndicate had provided Japan with over $150 million in direct financing, supplemented by another $50 million in credit facilities and derivative profits. This represented the largest private military financing operation in human history, exceeding the resources that most European governments could mobilize for warfare against major opponents. More importantly, the financial support was proving its strategic value through Japanese military successes that confirmed Schiff's assessment of Russian vulnerabilities. The destruction of the Russian Baltic fleet at Tsushima demonstrated that financial resources properly applied could indeed overcome apparent military disadvantages. Schiff's impossible gamble was succeeding beyond even his most optimistic expectations. The success created new opportunities for expanding financial warfare against Russian interests while supporting revolutionary activities that could complete the Tsarist regime's destruction from within. Schiff began planning the next phase of his campaign, direct support for Russian revolutionary organizations that could transform military defeat into complete political collapse. Chapter 6. War Financing. Admiral Togo Heihachiro stood on the bridge of his flagship Mikasa on May 27, 1905, commanding the most expensive naval force in human history. Every shell in his gun magazines, every ton of coal in his bunkers, every plate of armor protecting his ships had been purchased with American money channeled through Jacob Schiff's financial networks. The approaching Russian Baltic fleet represented the Tsarist Empire's last hope for military salvation, unaware they were sailing toward destruction financed by their most implacable enemy. The Battle of Tsushima that followed would vindicate Schiff's extraordinary financial gamble in the most dramatic fashion possible. In 18 hours of combat, Japanese forces would destroy 34 Russian warships while losing only 3 torpedo boats. The Russian Empire's naval power in the Pacific would cease to exist, purchased and delivered through Schiff's meticulous coordination of international capital markets. But this naval triumph represented only the visible culmination of financial warfare that had been reshaping military capabilities for over a year. Schiff's bond syndicate had provided Japan with resources that transformed a regional Asian power into a force capable of humiliating the world's largest empire. The process revealed how sophisticated financial engineering could overcome apparent military impossibilities through systematic resource mobilization. The transformation began with Japanese naval expansion that doubled the fleet size between 1904 and 1905. Schiff's financing allowed accelerated construction of battleships and cruisers that incorporated the latest European technology while maintaining production schedules that seemed impossible under normal commercial constraints. British shipyards worked around the clock on Japanese contracts, producing vessels that equaled or exceeded Russian naval capabilities. Equally important was the ammunition supply that sustained Japanese military operations throughout the conflict. European arms manufacturers had initially refused credit sales to Japan, viewing the nation as too small to guarantee payment for the enormous quantities required for modern warfare. Schiff's financial guarantees transformed these calculations, allowing Japanese forces to maintain artillery barrages and naval bombardments that consumed ammunition at unprecedented rates. The artillery component proved particularly crucial during the siege of Port Arthur, where Japanese forces needed continuous shell supplies to reduce Russian fortifications that had been designed to withstand conventional siege warfare. Schiff's networks provided access to German, British, and American ammunition production that kept Japanese guns firing when domestic manufacturing proved insufficient for sustained combat operations. Japanese military logistics also benefited from Schiff's international connections, which provided access to specialized equipment and technical expertise that domestic sources couldn't supply. Railroad construction in Korea and Manchuria accelerated dramatically with American engineering assistance, creating supply lines that could sustain large armies operating far from Japanese territory. Telegraph networks established with European help provided communications capabilities that gave Japanese commanders decisive advantages in coordinating complex military operations. The financial flows supporting these capabilities reached extraordinary complexity as the war progressed. Schiff's original bond syndicate evolved into a sophisticated network of interconnected financing arrangements that provided Japan with continuous access to capital, regardless of immediate military developments. Convertible securities allowed refinancing based on territorial gains, while credit facilities provided emergency funding during intensive combat operations. Currency exchange operations generated additional profits that supplemented direct military financing. As Japanese military success became apparent, international demand for yen increased substantially, while ruble values declined. Schiff's currency trading operations captured these spreads, while simultaneously undermining Russian purchasing power in international markets. The most innovative aspect involved using insurance and derivative markets to hedge Japanese financial risks while imposing additional costs on Russian operations. War risk insurance for Japanese shipping remained relatively affordable due to naval superiority, while Russian commercial vessels faced prohibitive premiums that effectively eliminated their international trade. Commodity derivatives secured Japanese access to essential raw materials, while denying similar advantages to Russian forces. These financial mechanisms enabled Japanese military strategies that would have been impossible under traditional funding constraints. The decision to engage the Russian Baltic Fleet at Tsushima represented enormous risk, as defeat would have eliminated Japan's naval superiority and potentially triggered financial collapse. Schiff's syndicate provided sufficient backing to justify Admiral Togo's aggressive tactics, knowing that decisive victory would generate enormous profits while confirming Japan's emergence as a major power. The battle's outcome exceeded even optimistic projections for Japanese success. Admiral Rozhestvensky's Russian fleet, representing the empire's last naval reserves, was virtually annihilated in a single engagement that demonstrated Japanese tactical superiority backed by superior equipment purchased through Schiff's financial networks. The victory established Japanese control over East Asian waters while eliminating Russian ability to threaten Japanese supply lines. International financial markets responded to Tsushima with massive capital flows that validated Schiff's strategic assessment. Japanese government bonds traded at substantial premiums while Russian securities collapsed to distressed levels. European investors who had initially questioned Japanese creditworthiness now competed aggressively for access to additional bond offerings that promised substantial returns backed by territorial conquests. The victory also triggered expansion of Schiff's financial warfare beyond simple Japanese support, to include direct attacks on Russian economic stability. With Japanese military success confirmed, syndicate members felt confident implementing strategies that targeted Russian government finances and commercial interests. Credit restrictions, currency manipulation, and commodity market operations systematically undermined Russian economic capacity. French banks, despite their government's Russian alliance, began quietly reducing exposure to Russian securities as confidence in Tsarist stability declined. German financial institutions followed similar patterns, viewing Japanese success as evidence of fundamental Russian weakness that made continued investment imprudent. British participation in anti-Russian financial operations increased dramatically as Japanese victory eliminated Russian threats to Indian security. These developments created opportunities for expanded support to revolutionary organizations operating within the Russian Empire. Military defeat and economic pressure had destabilized the Tsarist regime sufficiently to make internal revolution achievable with modest external assistance. Schiff began planning financial support for Russian opposition groups that could complete the regime's destruction from within. The financing mechanisms developed for Japanese military support proved adaptable to revolutionary activities that required even greater secrecy and operational flexibility. Networks of correspondent banks and commercial intermediaries that had moved funds to Japan could equally well supply Russian revolutionaries with weapons and operational financing. The same legal structures that concealed neutrality violations could hide support for insurrectionary activities. Most importantly, Japanese military success had demonstrated the practical effectiveness of coordinated financial warfare against apparently superior opponents. Schiff's methods could be replicated against other targets, creating possibilities for private influence over international affairs that challenged traditional governmental monopolies on foreign policy. Financial power, properly organized, could achieve political objectives that conventional diplomacy couldn't accomplish. By summer 1905, Schiff controlled financial networks capable of mobilizing hundreds of millions of dollars for objectives that served his vision of international justice. The Russian Empire tottered on the edge of complete collapse, maintained only by European governments that feared revolutionary contagion more than they valued their Russian ally. The moment had arrived for the final phase of Schiff's campaign, direct support for revolution that would eliminate the Tsarist regime permanently. The Japanese victory at Tsushima had proven that one man's determination, backed by sufficient financial resources and international coordination, could indeed topple empires that seemed invulnerable to conventional opposition. The lessons of this success would reshape international relations for generations, establishing financial power as a legitimate tool of international politics. Chapter 7. Naval Victory. At 2:05 p.m. on May 27, 1905, the impossible became inevitable. Admiral Togo's flagship Mikasa opened fire on the Russian battleship Suvorov at a range of 6,400 meters, beginning the most decisive naval engagement since Trafalgar. Every Japanese shell fired that day had been purchased with Jacob Schiff's money. Every tactical advantage the Japanese fleet possessed traced back to financial resources that Schiff's international syndicate had provided. The Battle of Tsushima would prove that properly applied capital could overcome any military disadvantage. The Russian Baltic fleet approaching through the Tsushima Straits represented the Tsarist Empire's final attempt to salvage something from its disastrous war with Japan. Admiral Rozhdestvensky commanded 38 warships that had sailed halfway around the world to restore Russian naval supremacy in the Pacific. These vessels carried the Empire's most experienced crews, its most modern equipment, and the desperate hopes of a regime facing complete military humiliation. What the Russians didn't understand was that they were sailing into battle against an enemy that had been systematically strengthened by the most sophisticated financial operation in history. Schiff's networks had provided Japan with naval capabilities that far exceeded what the empire's industrial base could normally support. British shipyards had delivered cutting-edge battleships financed through American capital markets. German armor manufacturers had supplied protective plating that rivaled anything in European service. American steel companies had provided raw materials that accelerated Japanese naval construction by years. The tactical balance reflected this financial advantage in precise mathematical terms. Japanese ships carried ammunition supplies that allowed sustained combat at maximum range, while Russian vessels faced restrictions imposed by their 8-month voyage from the Baltic Sea. Japanese naval architecture incorporated lessons from recent European innovations, while Russian designs reflected older concepts that prioritized impressive appearance over combat effectiveness. More importantly, Japanese naval personnel had received training that money couldn't normally purchase. British naval advisors, secretly compensated through Schiff's financial channels, had provided Japanese crews with gunnery techniques and tactical doctrine that reflected cutting-edge Royal Navy experience. American technical experts had optimized Japanese communication and fire control systems. German engineering consultants had enhanced Japanese engine performance and mechanical reliability. The battle began with Japanese tactical innovations that demonstrated superior training and equipment working in perfect coordination. Admiral Togo executed a crossing maneuver that brought his entire fleet into optimal firing positions while preventing Russian forces from concentrating their firepower effectively. This textbook evolution required precisely coordinated movement by ships whose crews had practiced extensively, using fuel and ammunition that Schiff's financing had provided. Japanese gunnery proved devastatingly accurate from the opening salvos. The battleship Suvorov, Admiral Rozhestvensky's flagship, suffered critical damage within the first 30 minutes as Japanese shells penetrated Russian armor and destroyed essential command systems. The systematic destruction reflected not just superior marksmanship, but access to ammunition types specifically designed for penetrating the latest armor configurations. Russian return fire proved largely ineffective due to tactical disadvantages that accumulated throughout the engagement. Their ships had suffered mechanical problems during the long voyage from Europe, reducing maximum speed and maneuverability. Coal quality deteriorated during months at sea, limiting engine performance when maximum power was essential. Most critically, Russian ammunition supplies had been restricted by financial constraints that prevented adequate stockpiling before departure. The engagement's turning point came when Japanese destroyer squadrons launched coordinated torpedo attacks that exploited Russian formation weaknesses. These small fast vessels had been constructed specifically for such operations, using designs provided by European naval architects whose services Schiff's syndicate had purchased. Their crews executed complex night attacks that demonstrated training impossible without extensive practice using live weapons. By dawn on May 28th, the Russian Baltic fleet had effectively ceased to exist as a combat force. 21 warships had been sunk or captured, including 6 modern battleships that represented the core of Russian naval strength. Admiral Rozhestvensky lay wounded aboard the captured battleship Nikolai I, while his surviving ships fled toward neutral ports where they would be interned for the war's duration. Japanese losses totaled 3 torpedo boats and fewer than 200 casualties, a disproportion that shocked international naval experts who had predicted bloody stalemate between roughly equal forces. The victory demonstrated how financial advantages could be translated into tactical superiority that made conventional strategic calculations irrelevant. International financial markets responded to Tsushima with immediate recognition of its broader implications. Japanese government bonds surged to unprecedented premiums as investors recognized that military success guaranteed territorial gains sufficient to service enormous war debts. Russian securities collapsed as confidence in Tsarist stability evaporated. European currencies fluctuated wildly as political leaders struggled to comprehend how a small Asian nation had humiliated one of their major powers. Schiff received the news in his Manhattan office at 3:30 a.m. Eastern Time, awakened by urgent cables from London correspondents who had monitored naval communications throughout the battle. His immediate reaction combined personal satisfaction with professional assessment of the victory's financial implications. The impossible gamble had succeeded completely, vindicating strategies that conservative bankers had dismissed as fantasy. More importantly, Tsushima validated Schiff's broader vision of financial warfare as a tool for achieving political transformation. Properly organized capital had proven capable of toppling empires that seemed invulnerable to conventional opposition. The methods developed for supporting Japan could be applied to other objectives that served Schiff's conception of international justice. The victory's immediate consequences extended far beyond East Asian power relationships. European governments recognized that traditional assumptions about military capability no longer applied when sophisticated financial networks could provide smaller nations with resources exceeding those of major empires. The balance of international power had fundamentally shifted toward entities that could mobilize capital rather than simply control territory. German Kaiser Wilhelm II reportedly spent hours studying maps of the Pacific, trying to comprehend how Russian naval supremacy had been eliminated so completely by a nation that hadn't existed as a modern power 20 years earlier. French military planners conducted emergency reviews of their alliance relationships, questioning whether Russian military guarantees retained any practical value. British strategic assessments acknowledged that Japanese naval victory had permanently altered Pacific power relationships in ways that favored British imperial interests. American reaction proved particularly significant for Schiff's long-term objectives. President Roosevelt privately expressed satisfaction with Japanese success while officially maintaining neutrality that had allowed American financial support for Japanese war efforts. The administration recognized that Schiff's operations had advanced American strategic interests without requiring government resources or political commitments. This governmental approval provided crucial validation for Schiff's methods and implicit authorization for expanded financial warfare operations. American authorities wouldn't obstruct future activities that served national interests while eliminating potential threats to American expansion. Schiff had effectively established financial power as a legitimate tool of American foreign policy. The victory also created opportunities for completing the destruction of Russian imperial power through support for revolutionary activities within the empire itself. Military defeat and financial pressure had destabilized the Tsarist regime to the point where relatively modest assistance to opposition groups could trigger complete political collapse. Schiff immediately began planning this next phase of his anti-Russian campaign. The networks developed for Japanese military support could equally well supply Russian revolutionaries with weapons and operational financing. Legal structures that had concealed neutrality violations could hide support for insurrectionary activities. International cooperation that had made Japanese victory possible could be redirected toward permanently eliminating the regime that had persecuted Jewish communities for centuries. The Battle of Tsushima had proven that one man's vision, backed by sufficient financial resources and international coordination, could indeed reshape the global balance of power. But for Jacob Schiff, naval victory represented only the beginning of a campaign that would culminate in the complete destruction of the Russian Empire and the emergence of a new international order, based on financial rather than traditional military power. Chapter 8: Revolution Funding. The coded telegram reached Jacob Schiff's private office on June 15, 1905, bearing a message that would have triggered international scandal if decoded by hostile intelligence services. Merchandise shipment approved. Delivery coordinates confirmed. Payment authorization required for expanded operations. The merchandise was weapons. The delivery coordinates were safe houses in Warsaw, St. Petersburg, and Moscow. The payment authorization would fund the most ambitious revolution in human history. Schiff's support for Russian revolutionary activities had begun cautiously during the war's early stages, limited to modest financial contributions channeled through established Jewish charitable organizations. But Japanese military success had created opportunities for systematic destabilization that could complete the Tsarist regime's destruction through internal collapse rather than external conquest. The revolutionary infrastructure already existed, built by decades of underground organization that connected industrial workers, intellectual dissidents, and ethnic minorities throughout the empire. These groups lacked only sufficient resources to transform sporadic resistance into coordinated insurrection. Schiff's financial networks could provide exactly the support that conventional revolutionary movements had never before accessed. The operation's complexity required unprecedented secrecy and organizational sophistication. Direct financial transfers to known revolutionary groups would have triggered immediate diplomatic protests and potential criminal prosecution under American neutrality laws. Schiff needed mechanisms that could move substantial amounts of money and weapons while maintaining plausible cover for routine commercial transactions. His solution involved expanding the same correspondent banking networks that had supported Japanese war financing. Funds moved through London merchant banks to German commercial houses, then to Austrian financial institutions serving Eastern European trade relationships. Each transfer appeared to support legitimate business activities: textile imports, grain exports, industrial equipment purchases. Documentary evidence revealed standard commercial transactions that concealed revolutionary financing. The weapons procurement presented greater challenges, as arms trafficking carried more severe legal penalties while requiring specialized knowledge that financial institutions couldn't normally provide. Schiff approached this problem through contacts developed during his Japanese operations, particularly European intermediaries who had arranged military equipment sales disguised as civilian purchases. British cooperation proved essential, as Royal Navy control of Baltic shipping allowed selective enforcement of arms embargoes that could facilitate revolutionary supply operations. Weapons ostensibly bound for South American conflicts were diverted to Scandinavian ports, where they disappeared into smuggling networks that reached deep into Russian territory. Finnish and Estonian fishing vessels carried arms shipments disguised as commercial cargo, while their crews received compensation that exceeded normal fishing profits by enormous margins. German participation required more elaborate coordination, as the Kaiser's government officially supported Russian stability despite private concerns about Tsarist competence. Individual German arms manufacturers quietly cooperated with Schiff's operations, viewing them as opportunities for profitable sales that advancing German interests by weakening a potential Eastern rival. The most sophisticated aspect involved coordinating revolutionary activities to maximize their destabilizing impact while avoiding premature exposure that could trigger massive government repression. Schiff's agents maintained communication with revolutionary leaders across the empire, providing strategic guidance based on intelligence gathered through his international business networks. These communications revealed revolutionary capabilities that far exceeded government estimates. The Social Democratic Labour Party had established cells in every major industrial centre, capable of organising strikes that could paralyse manufacturing and transportation. Jewish self-defence organisations possessed weapons stockpiles and training that enabled effective resistance against pogrom attacks. Ethnic nationalist movements in Poland, Finland, and the Caucasus had developed coordination mechanisms that could support simultaneous uprisings across multiple regions. The financial requirements for supporting such extensive operations demanded resources that dwarfed previous revolutionary financing. Schiff established secret accounts totaling $20 million specifically for Russian revolutionary support, funded through profits generated by Japanese bond operations and currency speculation against the ruble. This represented more money than revolutionary organizations had previously accessed in their entire histories. The distribution system channeled these resources through multiple pathways that reflected the revolutionary movement's diverse composition. Industrial strikes received funding for worker support during extended work stoppages, while intellectual groups obtained printing equipment for producing underground newspapers and propaganda materials. Ethnic nationalist organizations received weapons and explosives for sabotage operations against government infrastructure. Jewish revolutionary organizations received particular attention, reflecting Schiff's personal commitment to supporting resistance against anti-Semitic persecution. The Bund, the largest Jewish socialist organization, obtained sophisticated weapons that enabled successful defense operations against government-sponsored pogroms. These defensive victories demonstrated that Jewish communities would no longer accept passive victimization, fundamentally altering the dynamics of state-sponsored persecution. The coordination of these support operations required unprecedented intelligence gathering that provided Schiff with detailed knowledge of Russian internal conditions. His agents reported directly on government troop dispositions, police surveillance activities, and planned repression operations. This intelligence allowed revolutionary groups to avoid government traps while identifying optimal opportunities for destabilizing actions. The intelligence network also revealed the Tsarist regime's fundamental weaknesses with accuracy that exceeded most government assessments. Financial resources were depleted by war expenses and international credit restrictions that Schiff's operations had engineered. Military units showed declining morale due to repeated defeats and inadequate supplies. Government authority was fragmenting as regional officials lost confidence in central leadership. Most importantly, the reports confirmed that revolutionary coordination was achieving unprecedented effectiveness. The general strike called for October 1905 demonstrated organizational capabilities that brought the entire empire to a halt within days. Railroad workers abandoned their positions simultaneously across 11 time zones. Factory production ceased in every major industrial center. Telegraph communications failed as operators joined the work stoppage. The strike's success validated Schiff's assessment that properly supported revolutionary activities could indeed topple the Tsarist regime. Government forces proved incapable of maintaining basic order when confronted with systematic resistance supported by adequate financial resources. The empire's apparent strength concealed internal contradictions that skilled manipulation could exploit to achieve complete political transformation. Schiff's funding proved crucial during the strike's most critical phases, when continued resistance required sustaining workers without regular income for extended periods. Traditional revolutionary organizations had never possessed resources for such comprehensive support operations. Government calculations that economic pressure would force strikers back to work proved incorrect when external financing eliminated their primary vulnerability. The regime's response demonstrated increasing desperation as conventional repression methods proved inadequate against sophisticated resistance. Military units fired on unarmed protesters, triggering broader public outrage that expanded revolutionary support beyond traditional opposition groups. Police arrests of strike leaders were countered by immediate replacement with new organizers who had been prepared for such contingencies. International reaction to these developments reflected growing recognition that the Russian Empire faced existential crisis rather than temporary unrest. European governments quietly began contingency planning for potential Russian collapse, while financial markets treated Russian securities as distressed assets unlikely to retain significant value. Schiff monitored these developments with satisfaction, tempered by awareness that revolutionary success could trigger consequences beyond his control. Complete Tsarist collapse might produce chaos that threatened Jewish communities along with government authorities. Revolutionary governments might prove as hostile to Jewish interests as the regime they replaced. These concerns led Schiff to develop exit strategies that could preserve Jewish revolutionary organizations even if broader revolutionary movements faced defeat or internal conflict. Special financial provisions ensured that Jewish self-defense groups would retain weapons and resources regardless of overall political developments. Communication networks provided warning systems that could facilitate evacuation if necessary. The revolutionary financing operations also created precedents that would influence future international relations. Schiff had demonstrated that private financial networks could effectively support insurrectionary movements against established governments, challenging traditional assumptions about state sovereignty and non-interference. These methods could potentially be applied by other entities seeking political transformation through financial warfare. By autumn 1905, Schiff's revolutionary support operations had contributed to destabilizing the Russian Empire to the point where complete collapse seemed achievable. The combination of military defeat, economic pressure, and internal revolution had exceeded even his optimistic projections for success. The impossible dream of destroying the regime that had persecuted his people for centuries was approaching realization. Chapter 9. Empire Falls. The telegram that arrived at Tsar Nicholas II's desk on October 30th, 1905, contained two words that marked the end of an empire: total paralysis. General strikes had brought the entire Russian Empire to a complete standstill. No trains moved across the Trans-Siberian Railway. No factories operated in Moscow or St. Petersburg. No government offices functioned from Warsaw to Vladivostok. The empire that had once terrified Europe was collapsing under pressure that Jacob Schiff had systematically orchestrated from his Manhattan office. The revolution that consumed Russia in 1905 represented the culmination of Schiff's multi-year campaign to destroy Tsarist power through coordinated financial warfare. Military defeat by Japan had demonstrated the regime's fundamental weakness. Economic pressure through credit restrictions had depleted government resources. Revolutionary financing had provided opposition groups with capabilities they'd never previously possessed. The combination produced political collapse that exceeded even Schiff's ambitious objectives. The numbers told the story of systematic imperial disintegration. Over 2.7 million workers participated in the October General Strike, representing virtually every industrial enterprise in the empire. Railroad operations ceased across 40,000 miles of track, paralyzing transportation that connected the vast territories under Tsarist control. Telegraph communications failed as 60,000 operators abandoned their posts simultaneously. Government revenues dropped 80% as tax collection became impossible. Schiff's financial networks had made this coordination possible by providing revolutionary organizations with resources that enabled sustained resistance despite government pressure. Strike funds supported workers throughout extended work stoppages that would normally collapse within days due to economic necessity. Weapons stockpiles allowed effective defense against military intervention. Communication equipment maintained coordination between revolutionary groups across impossible distances. The sophistication of this revolutionary coordination amazed government officials who had underestimated opposition capabilities for decades. Police intelligence reports described organizational structures that rivaled government administration in their complexity and exceeded it in their effectiveness. Revolutionary committees operated in every major city, connected through communication networks that provided real-time coordination of resistance activities. Most shocking was the evidence of international financing that had supported these capabilities. Government investigators discovered banking records showing massive capital flows from American and European sources to revolutionary organizations. The amounts involved exceeded the annual budgets of most government ministries, representing private financing on a scale that governments had never contemplated. Schiff's role in organizing this support became apparent as investigators traced financial transactions through the complex networks that had concealed their true purpose. American banking records revealed transfers totaling millions of dollars to European intermediaries who had channeled funds to Russian revolutionary groups. The systematic nature of this support indicated coordination that went far beyond spontaneous charitable contributions. International reaction to these revelations reflected growing understanding that traditional concepts of national sovereignty had become obsolete when private financial networks could effectively wage war against established governments. European chancelleries conducted urgent consultations about the implications of Schiff's success for their own internal stability. If American financiers could topple the Russian Empire, no government was secure against similar operations. The Tsarist regime's desperate response demonstrated complete loss of effective authority. Nicholas II's October Manifesto promised constitutional government and civil liberties that revolutionary groups had been demanding for decades. These concessions, which might have satisfied opposition movements under different circumstances, were dismissed as inadequate given the regime's demonstrated weakness. Revolutionary organizations had gained sufficient strength through Schiff's support to demand complete political transformation rather than modest reforms. The possibility of total victory had replaced hopes for gradual improvement. Why accept constitutional monarchy when republican government seemed achievable? Why negotiate with a regime that was clearly collapsing under systematic pressure? The government's military response proved equally ineffective against resistance that possessed adequate financial backing. Traditional suppression methods assumed that revolutionary movements would lack resources for sustained opposition. When troops fired on protesters, replacement demonstrators appeared within hours. When police arrested strike leaders, new organizers immediately took their positions. Government forces found themselves confronting an opposition that seemed to possess unlimited resources. Schiff monitored these developments with satisfaction, mixed with concern about potential consequences beyond his control. The revolution was succeeding more completely than he had anticipated, creating possibilities for outcomes that might not serve Jewish interests, despite eliminating Tsarist persecution. Revolutionary governments could prove as hostile to minority communities as the regime they replaced. These concerns intensified as revolutionary violence expanded beyond government targets to include ethnic conflicts that threatened Jewish communities. Pogroms organized by reactionary groups seeking to blame political chaos on Jewish revolutionary participation killed hundreds of civilians who had no involvement in political activities. The pattern suggested that Russian anti-Semitism might survive regime change, requiring continued vigilance and defensive preparation. Schiff's response involved expanding support for Jewish self-defense organizations, while maintaining broader revolutionary financing that advanced overall anti-Tsarist objectives. Jewish communities received additional weapons and training that enabled effective resistance against pogrom attacks, while general revolutionary activities continued to pressure the regime toward complete collapse. The international financial implications of Russian political collapse created both opportunities and challenges for Schiff's future operations. Russian government securities became worthless, eliminating European investments worth billions of dollars. French banks that had provided the largest source of Russian government financing faced potential bankruptcy as their bond portfolios collapsed. German financial institutions struggled with similar losses that threatened their stability. These developments validated Schiff's strategy of systematic financial warfare, while demonstrating its potential for triggering broader economic instability. European stock markets declined sharply as investors recognized that established governments could no longer guarantee the security of their securities. Currency values fluctuated wildly as political uncertainty spread beyond Russian borders. But the crisis also provided Schiff with enhanced influence over international financial markets that had been destabilized by his operations. His networks possessed resources and expertise that European institutions desperately needed to manage the chaos that Russian collapse had created. Governments that had previously ignored American financial power now sought Schiff's cooperation for stabilizing their own economies. This transformation of international financial relationships represented perhaps the most significant long-term consequence of Schiff's anti-Russian campaign. European financial dominance, which had shaped global economic relationships for centuries, was giving way to American leadership that reflected superior organizational capabilities and financial resources. The shift became particularly evident in East Asian markets, where Japanese victory had eliminated Russian influence, while establishing new financial centers connected to American rather than European capital markets. Japanese government bonds now traded as premium securities, backed by territorial acquisitions and industrial development that provided secure revenue sources. Schiff's personal satisfaction with these developments reflected not just successful achievement of his anti-Russian objectives, but vindication of his broader vision for financial power as a tool of international politics. Private networks properly organized could indeed achieve political transformation that conventional diplomacy couldn't accomplish. Money strategically applied could topple empires that seemed invulnerable to traditional opposition. Yet the revolution's incomplete success reminded Schiff that financial warfare faced limitations that required careful management. Revolutionary movements could be supported and directed, but not completely controlled by external financing. Political transformation might eliminate targeted regimes without necessarily producing outcomes that served all objectives of their foreign supporters. These lessons would shape Schiff's future activities as he considered applying successful methods to other targets that threatened his vision of international justice. The Russian Empire was collapsing, but other oppressive regimes remained vulnerable to similar financial pressure if properly applied. The precedents established through his anti-Russian campaign could guide future operations that advanced broader objectives. By December 1905, the Russian Empire existed only in name, its authority fragmenting across territories that could no longer be governed from St. Petersburg. Schiff had achieved the impossible dream that had motivated his entire career, the destruction of the regime that had persecuted his people for centuries. But this success raised new questions about how financial power should be used to shape the emerging international order. Chapter 8. Revolution Funding. The coded telegram reached Jacob Schiff's private office on June 15, 1905, bearing a message that would have triggered international scandal if decoded by hostile intelligence services. Merchandise shipment approved. Delivery coordinates confirmed. Payment authorization required for expanded operations. The merchandise was weapons. The delivery coordinates were safe houses in Warsaw, St. Petersburg, and Moscow. The payment authorization would fund the most ambitious revolution in human history. Schiff's support for Russian revolutionary activities had begun cautiously during the war's early stages, limited to modest financial contributions channeled through established Jewish charitable organizations. But Japanese military success had created opportunities for systematic destabilization that could complete the Tsarist regime's destruction through internal collapse rather than external conquest. The revolutionary infrastructure already existed, built by decades of underground organization that connected industrial workers, intellectual dissidents, and ethnic minorities throughout the empire. These groups lacked only sufficient resources to transform sporadic resistance into coordinated insurrection. Schiff's financial networks could provide exactly the support that conventional revolutionary movements had never before accessed. The operation's complexity required unprecedented secrecy and organizational sophistication. Direct financial transfers to known revolutionary groups would have triggered immediate diplomatic protests and potential criminal prosecution under American neutrality laws. Schiff needed mechanisms that could move substantial amounts of money and weapons while maintaining plausible cover for routine commercial transactions. His solution involved expanding the same correspondent banking networks that had supported Japanese war financing. Funds moved through London merchant banks to German commercial houses, then to Austrian financial institutions serving Eastern European trade relationships. Each transfer appeared to support legitimate business activities: textile imports, grain exports, industrial equipment purchases. Documentary evidence revealed standard commercial transactions that concealed revolutionary financing. The weapons procurement presented greater challenges, as arms trafficking carried more severe legal penalties while requiring specialized knowledge that financial institutions couldn't normally provide. Schiff approached this problem through contacts developed during his Japanese operations, particularly European intermediaries who had arranged military equipment sales disguised as civilian purchases. British cooperation proved essential, as Royal Navy control of Baltic shipping allowed selective enforcement of arms embargoes that could facilitate revolutionary supply operations. Weapons ostensibly bound for South American conflicts were diverted to Scandinavian ports, where they disappeared into smuggling networks that reached deep into Russian territory. Finnish and Estonian fishing vessels carried arms shipments disguised as commercial cargo, while their crews received compensation that exceeded normal fishing profits by enormous margins. German participation required more elaborate coordination, as the Kaiser's government officially supported Russian stability despite private concerns about Tsarist competence. Individual German arms manufacturers quietly cooperated with Schiff's operations, viewing them as opportunities for profitable sales that advancing German interests by weakening a potential Eastern rival. The most sophisticated aspect involved coordinating revolutionary activities to maximize their destabilizing impact while avoiding premature exposure that could trigger massive government repression. Schiff's agents maintained communication with revolutionary leaders across the empire, providing strategic guidance, based on intelligence gathered through his international business networks. These communications revealed revolutionary capabilities that far exceeded government estimates. The Social Democratic Labour Party had established cells in every major industrial centre, capable of organising strikes that could paralyse manufacturing and transportation. Jewish self-defence organisations possessed weapons stockpiles and training that enabled effective resistance against pogrom attacks. Ethnic nationalist movements in Poland, Finland, and the Caucasus had developed coordination mechanisms that could support simultaneous uprisings across multiple regions. The financial requirements for supporting such extensive operations demanded resources that dwarfed previous revolutionary financing. Schiff established secret accounts totaling $20 million specifically for Russian revolutionary support, funded through profits generated by Japanese bond operations and currency speculation against the ruble. This represented more money than revolutionary organizations had previously accessed in their entire histories. The distribution system channeled these resources through multiple pathways that reflected the revolutionary movement's diverse composition. Industrial strikes received funding for worker support during extended work stoppages, while intellectual groups obtained printing equipment for producing underground newspapers and propaganda materials. Ethnic nationalist organizations received weapons and explosives for sabotage operations against government infrastructure. Jewish revolutionary organizations received particular attention, reflecting Schiff's personal commitment to supporting resistance against anti-Semitic persecution. The Bund, the largest Jewish socialist organization, obtained sophisticated weapons that enabled successful defense operations against government-sponsored pogroms. These defensive victories demonstrated that Jewish communities would no longer accept passive victimization, fundamentally altering the dynamics of state-sponsored persecution. The coordination of these support operations required unprecedented intelligence gathering that provided Schiff with detailed knowledge of Russian internal conditions. His agents reported directly on government troop dispositions, police surveillance activities, and planned repression operations. This intelligence allowed revolutionary groups to avoid government traps while identifying optimal opportunities for destabilizing actions. The intelligence network also revealed the Tsarist regime's fundamental weaknesses with accuracy that exceeded most government assessments. Financial resources were depleted by war expenses and international credit restrictions that Schiff's operations had engineered. Military units showed declining morale due to repeated defeats and inadequate supplies. Government authority was fragmenting as regional officials lost confidence in central leadership. Most importantly, the reports confirmed that revolutionary coordination was achieving unprecedented effectiveness. The general strike called for October 1905 demonstrated organizational capabilities that brought the entire empire to a halt within days. Railroad workers abandoned their positions simultaneously across 11 time zones. Factory production ceased in every major industrial center. Telegraph communications failed as operators joined the work stoppage. The strike's success validated Schiff's assessment that properly supported revolutionary activities could indeed topple the Tsarist regime. Government forces proved incapable of maintaining basic order when confronted with systematic resistance supported by adequate financial resources. The empire's apparent strength concealed internal contradictions that skilled manipulation could exploit to achieve complete political transformation. Schiff's funding proved crucial during the strike's most critical phases, when continued resistance required sustaining workers without regular income for extended periods. Traditional revolutionary organizations had never possessed resources for such comprehensive support operations. Government calculations that economic pressure would force strikers back to work proved incorrect when external financing eliminated their primary vulnerability. The regime's response demonstrated increasing desperation as conventional repression methods proved inadequate against sophisticated resistance. Military units fired on unarmed protesters, triggering broader public outrage that expanded revolutionary support beyond traditional opposition groups. Police arrests of strike leaders were countered by immediate replacement with new organizers who had been prepared for such contingencies. International reaction to these developments reflected growing recognition that the Russian Empire faced existential crisis rather than temporary unrest. European governments quietly began contingency planning for potential Russian collapse, while financial markets treated Russian securities as distressed assets unlikely to retain significant value. Schiff monitored these developments with satisfaction, tempered by awareness that revolutionary success could trigger consequences beyond his control. Complete Tsarist collapse might produce chaos that threatened Jewish communities along with government authorities. Revolutionary governments might prove as hostile to Jewish interests as the regime they replaced. These concerns led Schiff to develop exit strategies that could preserve Jewish revolutionary organizations even if broader revolutionary movements faced defeat or internal conflict. Special financial provisions ensured that Jewish self-defense groups would retain weapons and resources regardless of overall political developments. Communication networks provided warning systems that could facilitate evacuation if necessary. The revolutionary financing operations also created precedents that would influence future international relations. Schiff had demonstrated that private financial networks could effectively support insurrectionary movements against established governments, challenging traditional assumptions about state sovereignty and non-interference. These methods could potentially be applied by other entities seeking political transformation through financial warfare. By autumn 1905, Schiff's revolutionary support operations had contributed to destabilizing the Russian Empire to the point where complete collapse seemed achievable. The combination of military defeat, economic pressure, and internal revolution had exceeded even his optimistic projections for success. The impossible dream of destroying the regime that had persecuted his people for centuries was approaching realization. Chapter 9. Empire Falls. The telegram that arrived at Tsar Nicholas II's desk on October 30th, 1905, contained two words that marked the end of an empire: total paralysis. General strikes had brought the entire Russian Empire to a complete standstill. No trains moved across the Trans-Siberian Railway. No factories operated in Moscow or St. Petersburg. No government offices functioned from Warsaw to Vladivostok. The empire that had once terrified Europe was collapsing under pressure that Jacob Schiff had systematically orchestrated from his Manhattan office. The revolution that consumed Russia in 1905 represented the culmination of Schiff's multi-year campaign to destroy Tsarist power through coordinated financial warfare. Military defeat by Japan had demonstrated the regime's fundamental weakness. Economic pressure through credit restrictions had depleted government resources. Revolutionary financing had provided opposition groups with capabilities they'd never previously possessed. The combination produced political collapse that exceeded even Schiff's ambitious objectives. The numbers told the story of systematic imperial disintegration. Over 2.7 million workers participated in the October general strike, representing virtually every industrial enterprise in the empire. Railroad operations ceased across 40,000 miles of track, paralyzing transportation that connected the vast territories under Tsarist control. Telegraph communications failed as 60,000 operators abandoned their posts simultaneously. Government revenues dropped 80% as tax collection became impossible. Schiff's financial networks had made this coordination possible by providing revolutionary organizations with resources that enabled sustained resistance despite government pressure. Strike funds supported workers throughout extended work stoppages that would normally collapse within days due to economic necessity. Weapons stockpiles allowed effective defense against military intervention. Communication equipment maintained coordination between revolutionary groups across impossible distances. The sophistication of this revolutionary coordination amazed government officials who had underestimated opposition capabilities for decades. Police intelligence reports described organizational structures that rivaled government administration in their complexity and exceeded it in their effectiveness. Revolutionary committees operated in every major city, connected through communication networks that provided real-time coordination of resistance activities. Most shocking was the evidence of international financing that had supported these capabilities. Government investigators discovered banking records showing massive capital flows from American and European sources to revolutionary organizations. The amounts involved exceeded the annual budgets of most government ministries, representing private financing on a scale that governments had never contemplated. Schiff's role in organizing this support became apparent as investigators traced financial transactions through the complex networks that had concealed their true purpose. American banking records revealed transfers totaling millions of dollars to European intermediaries who had channeled funds to Russian revolutionary groups. The systematic nature of this support indicated coordination that went far beyond spontaneous charitable contributions. International reaction to these revelations reflected growing understanding that traditional concepts of national sovereignty had become obsolete when private financial networks could effectively wage war against established governments. European chancelleries conducted urgent consultations about the implications of Schiff's success for their own internal stability. If American financiers could topple the Russian Empire, no government was secure against similar operations. The Tsarist regime's desperate response demonstrated complete loss of effective authority. Nicholas II's October Manifesto promised constitutional government and civil liberties that revolutionary groups had been demanding for decades. These concessions, which might have satisfied opposition movements under different circumstances, were dismissed as inadequate given the regime's demonstrated weakness. Revolutionary organizations had gained sufficient strength through Schiff's support to demand complete political transformation rather than modest reforms. The possibility of total victory had replaced hopes for gradual improvement. Why accept constitutional monarchy when republican government seemed achievable? Why negotiate with a regime that was clearly collapsing under systematic pressure? The government's military response proved equally ineffective against resistance that possessed adequate financial backing. Traditional suppression methods assumed that revolutionary movements would lack resources for sustained opposition. When troops fired on protesters, replacement demonstrators appeared within hours. When police arrested strike leaders, new organizers immediately took their positions. Government forces found themselves confronting an opposition that seemed to possess unlimited resources. Schiff monitored these developments with satisfaction, mixed with concern about potential consequences beyond his control. The revolution was succeeding more completely than he had anticipated, creating possibilities for outcomes that might not serve Jewish interests, despite eliminating Tsarist persecution. Revolutionary governments could prove as hostile to minority communities as the regime they replaced. These concerns intensified as revolutionary violence expanded beyond government targets to include ethnic conflicts that threatened Jewish communities. Pogroms organized by reactionary groups seeking to blame political chaos on Jewish revolutionary